And data really is fundamental in social change, and I don't say that lightly. I'm a person who actually sometimes struggles with data and understanding it, but through my research and through working with the US foundations, what the lesson that I learned time and time again was that the conversation starts with data, with baseline data about where we're at, in order to be able to show how and what we're changing. It's important, though, to bear in mind that data alone is not sufficient to create change, but transparent data is necessary to measure progress towards social justice. So it's a tool, it's not the be all and end all, but it's a very valuable tool to get us to the point where we need to get to. Now, if you remember, on the very first session, we gave you all the spectrum tool with a list of indicators which showed different measures to see whether or not your foundations were where they were on the diversity, equity and inclusion framework. And I've just picked out the key indicators from that original tool which referred to data. And in order to have a fully implemented DEI framework, all of these indicators should be present in your foundation. So there should be a systematic collection, disaggregation and publication of data on grant making, disaggregation and publication of data on board, staff, advisor, grantee diversity, analysis on how to understand and close the gaps, and systematic application of an impact analysis in relation to that data and how it affected key operations. So on that sort of very broad spectrum, there were lots of different indicators in relation to how you did your grant making, in relation to boards, in relation to how you operated. These are the ones that were specifically talked about data. So it recognises that collecting, disaggregating and analysing data is critical for all grant making foundations. And hopefully once we've gone through this 2-3 year process of moving along the spectrum, you will all be able to tick the box on these indicators and say, yes, we collect, yes, we disaggregate, and yes, we publish our data and analyse it. So why should we collect data? Essentially, it's really to set benchmarks to help us identify funding trends, gaps and opportunities, and to really make tangible and visceral issues of inequality and underrepresentation. That sort of statement really summarises for me why it's so important, and that's the phrase or the narrative that I use when I talk to my board. In particular, I talk about the fact that collecting data indicates what you value. You tend to measure what you value, and simply asking those important questions about underrepresentation, about gaps, etc., provides important signals also to the rest of the sector about what's important to you. Addressing inequality, addressing historical inequality, disparities and gaps in funding distribution is critical to all of this. Quite often foundations talk about addressing poverty and inequality, and from my experience, if you really want to tackle inequality, you need to know the data and identify where the gaps are. Transparency and accountability are really important, particularly now and particularly for our sector. We are not scrutinised in the same way as corporates or the public sector, and therefore, in some ways, excellence in our sector is self-imposed. We need to be self-aware enough to realise that transparency and scrutiny and accountability will actually help us be more effective grant makers, and being open and transparent about where we fund, how we fund, who makes the decisions is all part of that process. There are also questions being asked about lack of diversity within the foundation sector. Charities So White have done a brilliant job at highlighting the underrepresentation and lack of diversity within the sector, particularly talking about boards and staff. And this is all part of the remit in terms of collecting data. But ultimately, it's about being effective. We want to know that the grant funding, the social investment that we're making actually makes a difference. And in order to do that, we need to be able to measure that and to see and to be able to produce data and evidence to show how we're doing it. Now, before we get into the specifics of the data that we want to collect and funding distribution, etc., there are certain prerequisites to collecting the data. It's not a case of, okay, we've done this webinar and now let's just go and start collecting data. There are certain things which need to be set in place before you can start that journey. Firstly, authority. Everybody, including the board, needs to understand and prioritize data collection and understand why it's important. It's not something that you can do on your own without that authorizing environment to say that this is important. And that leads to the second point, which is why this is important. You must be able to clarify and express and articulate internally and externally why demographic data is important to your organization, and put in writing why this is important so anybody can see why you're collecting and what you're collecting. And because quite often, especially when you start collecting data in relation to demographics, you're wandering into territory where you're into sensitive territory. You're asking questions about identity, about background perhaps, about class, or other indicators, and so you have to be really sensitive. But in order to be sensitive and in order to understand and explain to others why this is important, you have to have a very clear internal message about why this is important. And one statement which I thought was quite a good statement, which I will read out to you, is this one from the California Endowment, who state the data collected will serve multiple purposes: to help us understand how we reflect the communities we serve, to equip our staff with critical data to better serve the needs of our communities, and to track our progress with our board and our grantees and communities. So that reasoning and rationale sets out the basis for what data you want to collect. Now, in terms of the data that you want to collect, this can be very broad, and we're going to go into the specifics of that a bit later. But you as a foundation will, it's highly unlikely that you will collect exactly the same as other foundations. It really depends on your own ethos, your priorities, your historical background, the type of foundation you are. But you will need to go through a process of defining what data you want to collect, and standards. What's the best way to ask for information, way of codifying information, and we will come on to this hopefully a bit later on. And how are you going to collect this data? If you're a very small foundation with 1 or 2 members of staff, operationally you may want to collect a huge amount of data, but practically is it going to be possible? And that takes into account your resources and your capacity. And the final thing that has to be put in place before you can start this journey is the review process. Who's going to be reviewing this data? What's going to be the action that takes place? It's a constantly iterative and developing process. It's not a snapshot of, okay, we've done this once now and that's it, we're done. So those are the things that you need to bear in mind before you start the journey to collect data. And here you're all going to get these slides afterwards, but I've put 2 case studies of actually American foundations and how they've used data to inform their practice. Because essentially this is what we're talking about. We're not collecting data to collect data for data's sake. It's there about changing our policies, practices and decision making. The funders for LGBTQ issues, that was a really interesting case study where they actually changed their mission and their grant making priorities, and set up 2 new programs just because of the journey that they went through, looking at data and where the need was. And Annie Casey Foundation, I mean, they're a brilliant foundation and you know, miles ahead of many others. And they talk about how they use race-based data to reduce disparities in juvenile detention. So tracing that link from data to actual social change, to actual, you know, through grant-making programs, through social investment, to real outcomes and impact for people. And I would recommend after this session, if you can, have a look at these 2 case studies, because if your data doesn't change anything, it doesn't move your policies or your practices, or it doesn't lead to a process of introspection and analysis, then it's just a hypothetical exercise. A number of points that I just wanted to raise very briefly were something that I've touched on about privacy. You know, privacy is something obviously incredibly important to people. Once you start asking for demographic data, you can get into a lot of complexities. And so I've put a link there where the funders for LGBTQ issues have actually given some really good guidance about handling the collection of this data in a sensitive way. The classification system, I'm just going to see if I can actually get onto that website. I'm hoping you can all see this. 1 second. So this, this link is on the slide as well. In America, this organization, Candid, have actually produced a philanthropy classification system. Now, this is something that I'm really interested in because it gives standard classifications for the whole sector. And it does it in terms of age groups, ethnic and racial groups, gender, religious groups, etc. And maybe when we come on to talking about how we go forward at the end of the session, this is something which may be a useful tool for the philanthropic sector, because we are constantly talking about the fact that we don't have standardized definitions for a lot of things. You know, there's very little agreement about terms, terminology, what we're measuring, who we're measuring. And, you know, if we can get in 2 or 3 years, we can get to a place where we have a similar classification system, that would be brilliant. But we'll talk about that later. Just go back to my presentation. And a further note about measuring identity. Quite often you know, I'm sure you've all filled in those diversity monitoring forms where they ask you to identify your gender, your ethnicity, you know, your background in using various indicators, and those categories are very standalone. But actually, identity is incredibly complex, and so recognizing that and working towards the way where we can incorporate the complexity of how people identify themselves is something that I think we should really be discussing a lot more. So in terms of specifics and what we want to measure, normally grant-making foundations look at two main pieces of work: internal demographics and external funding distribution. And they look, particularly when they're looking at demographics, they look at the protected characteristics, which I've listed there. But sometimes they also look at additional elements such as socioeconomic background, class, intersectionality. Those are the typical sort of data sets that grant-making foundations seek to collect and analyse. One example which I came across, which I thought was really interesting, was from the Ford Foundation. And if you get a chance, you can have a look at their trustee and employee diversity update. And they actually publish, in terms of internally, the current composition of CEO, senior leaders, program staff. They also publish data in relation to recruitment and application for positions, new hires, turnover, and promotions. So who has got promoted, what background are they from? So it's not just about having that one snapshot of, okay, we've got X number of people at this position at this moment in time, but it's also about measuring progression. Who is being hired, who's being promoted, who is progressing to the most senior leadership positions. And another data set that they collect is in relation to generational representation. So they actually classify their staff and their trustees using this terminology: traditionalists, baby boomer, Generation X, and millennials. And I thought that's actually the first time I've seen it classified as that. But given that we, in our day-to-day narrative, we use all of this terminology a lot. We talk about baby boomers, we talk about millennials, we talk about the difference between them. I think it's actually an interesting statistic to have, to see, that generational gaps or generational representation, which we may or may not have. And then externally, looking at funding distribution, Charlotte's actually going to talk about the tool that she developed with a couple of others about looking at where our funding is going. Now, up until this point, up until the development of this tool, it was very difficult for foundations to collectively analyse where their funding was distributed in terms of population. Now, my foundation, along with, I'm sure, a couple of others in this group, have actually used that funding distribution tool. And it's been really, really helpful, because for the first time it provides standardized definitions in relation to BAME communities, and it provides definitions of what a BAME-led organisation is. It's a starting point. I mean, obviously it's focused on race, but it can be adapted for any of the protected characteristics. And what I found interesting was that this distribution tool raised a lot more questions in my foundation than it answered. But I think that's good. I think that's useful, because it wasn't an answer to our questions. It actually raised more questions, and now we're doing even more analysis about our distribution. Asking grantees to complete information. So one way of assessing your funding distribution is obviously yourself to look across, like we did, across our grant making pots, and make judgments about where that funding was being distributed, taking into account what's been said on the application form. Another way is to ask grantees to complete information about their communities, and Arbid from the Arts Council will be talking a lot more about this. But if you are asking grantees, be very aware of a number of points. Make it the process of answering those questions very simple. Provide them extra funding and support if required, explaining the why, and recognizing and being very aware that you're not imposing a further extractive relationship. And is there a way of enabling and bringing the grantees into the conversation at a very early point to explain and to engage them with the fact that if you're able as a grant maker to show your funding distribution or to analyse your funding distribution, hopefully it will lead to greater equity in terms of funding. So it's beneficial for everybody. And there's some resources there that I've listed about engaging grantees for DEI work. Here was some examples of information where grant makers have asked grantees for demographic data or to collect demographic data on their behalf. And I thought these two examples were really useful. The first one states at the end, we're collecting this information to get a better look at ourselves and to spot deficiencies, gaps, or implicit biases in our grant making processes. The second one again says our purpose is to mitigate potential implicit bias, ensure we support diverse and grantees, and this is how we will use aggregated data to understand broad trends and spot potential deficiencies. So the why, when you're talking to grantees and when you're asking them perhaps to take part in this process, is really, really important. And finally, a number of very quick points just to help you on your path. And Charlotte and I had a very long conversation about perfection and the fact that we shouldn't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Data collection, especially when you start it, can be overwhelming, will not be 100% perfect, but you have to see this as an evolving journey. You start somewhere, you start with something, and hopefully this is where I'm hoping that the coalition really comes into play, is that we share with each other what we're doing, what is working for us, and collectively we can perhaps pilot a system. You know, the fact that 360 Giving are here, the fact that Caroline and Danielle are working on something in relation to an index, you know, between us all within this room, you know, with 30 or so grant-making foundations, maybe we can pilot something which can work for us. But I really do believe that if we work collectively, we've got a lot more better chance of succeeding than if we do this work individually. And those other points about working with our peers, working in collaboration, sometimes using external organisations to take on the task. That I saw some examples where grant-making foundations outsourced demographic data collection to an external organisation, so that because they were concerned that their own staff and trustees were worried about privacy and the HR staff within the foundation knowing their background. So by cutting their own HR staff out, they were able to reassure them that nobody in the foundation will have access to that data. So that there are various mechanisms that you can use. And my final point is to support field-wide data aggregators such as 360 Giving. And again, I'm sure Fran can talk about how, you know, when they started, it wasn't perfect, but they're getting to a place now where more and more foundations are involved, and it just, not only does it make us more effective as grant makers, we can see where our funding is going, but in terms of transparency, in terms of helping charities who want to apply to us, that is also critical. So I shall end it there.